Good morning, welcome to the Heritage Foundation. I'm Niall Gardner, Director of the Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom here at Heritage. It is my pleasure to introduce the Right Honourable Liam Fox, MP. Liam has been a frequent visitor to the Heritage Foundation for the past 2 decades, during which time he has worked tirelessly to advance the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain. In fact, I can think of no stronger friend of the American people across the Atlantic than Liam Fox. Throughout his political career, Dr. Fox has been a staunch Thatcherite conservative, dedicated to the principles of limited government, a strong national defence, and a robust transatlantic alliance. Liam has been a Member of Parliament since 1992 and served as Defence Secretary of the United Kingdom from 2010 to 2011. He has also served as Shadow Foreign Secretary, Shadow Defence Secretary, Shadow Health Secretary, and as co-chairman of the Conservative Party. His most recent book is Rising Tides, Facing the Challenges of a New Era. Today, Dr. Fox will address the grave threat posed to the United States and its allies by Iran's nuclear ambitions, with Tehran continuing to act as the world's largest exporter of state-sponsored terrorism. He will assess the implications for the free world following the recent agreement signed between the P5+1 and Iran in Vienna, and what the deal means for regional and global security. Please join me in welcoming our very good friend, Liam Fox.
Well, thank you very much, Niall, and it's a pleasure to be back here at Heritage, and particularly to be talking about a subject which, while dominant in the American media, is almost entirely absent from the UK media. In fact, unless you have an interest in foreign affairs, you might not know in the United Kingdom that a deal with Iran had actually been undertaken. For the sake of clarity, let me say at the outset that I think that any deal that genuinely put the acquisition of a nuclear weapon capability beyond the reach of Iran would be a good thing. It would be good for the region, it would be good for global security, because if Iran were ever to achieve such an objective, it would be the trigger for a destabilizing arms race in the region with potentially catastrophic results. But before I turn to the deal itself, let's briefly look at the background to the negotiations. The election of Hassan Rouhani as Iranian president in June 2013 was heralded by certain sections of the Western commentariat as a landmark moment. Here was a government who we would be able to do business with, a government that would bring Iran in from the cold. And calls for caution from seasoned Iran observers were lost in the all too familiar now triumph of wishful thinking over critical analysis and the superficial obsession with media-friendly projection. Fast forward to 2015, and it's now become clear that the country has not changed direction. It was never going to, and those who expected change fundamentally misunderstood the structure of Iranian power. President Rouhani was destined to only ever have a limited influence in a state dominated by the supreme leader and the Revolutionary Guard. And Khamenei has shown an amazing ability for consistency that Western politicians can only dream of. He's never wavered in his detestation of the United States, the contempt for the existence of the State of Israel, or his belief about the purity of the Islamic Revolution and the cultural threats from outside. And critics are only half joking when they say that he's more afraid of McDonald's than Mossad. Nor has President Rouhani's administration brought any respite for the Iranian people. In 2014, Iran was the world's leader in executions per capita. Freedoms that we in the West take for granted continue to be aggressively curtailed. Persecution of those who supported the Green Movement and their families continues relentlessly. And the Western media seem curiously detached from, or even indifferent to, the plight of their savagely repressed Iranian colleagues. Iran remains a sponsor of state terrorism, providing financial, logistical, and material support to Islamist terror groups across the region, including those who targeted British and American forces when they were in Afghanistan and Iraq. It is just not possible, nor is it responsible, to see Iran's nuclear ambitions outside the context of its support for terror proxies, arguably the defining element of its foreign policy. And anxieties over Iran's nuclear intentions are not in the realms of paranoia or fantasy. They are well placed. Iran's extensive nuclear program features many of the key components required to facilitate the domestic production of a nuclear weapon: possession of large quantities of enriched materials, knowledge to convert enriched materials into a weaponized form, and the plans to develop a delivery mechanism in the form of ballistic missiles. For those who say, and I hear many of those voices here in Washington, that Iran should be given the benefit of the doubt, let me say this. The country has a long history of clandestine nuclear work. 2 of the nuclear-related facilities at Natanz and Iraq, which are at the center of the international community's concerns, were constructed secretly in a clear breach of the spirit, if not the letter, of Iran's obligations under the NPT. For years, Iran has used these facilities to enrich uranium to levels and quantities beyond those required for a legitimate and peaceful civil nuclear program. Iran routinely neglects its obligations to cooperate with the IAEA, including repeatedly denying inspectors access to contentious nuclear-related facilities such as the one at Parchin. And this facility is suspected of having previously undertaken tests related to triggers of nuclear weapons. It is logical to assume that Iran's intentions have been and are to develop a nuclear weapons capability at some point in the future. And any claims that its intentions are exclusively peaceful should not be regarded as credible. So let's turn to the deal that has been agreed. In particular, let's measure it against the timescale set, the issue of sanctions and assets, and perhaps most importantly, verification. Let's remember at the outset that the original aim of the international community was to ensure that Iran would never have the ability to possess a nuclear weapon. Now we find ourselves in the position where these original aims have somehow morphed into an agreement with Iran that merely puts its nuclear ambitions on hold in suspended animation for a period of 10 years. This all seems to be predicated on the belief that in this time frame, internal change in Iran will produce a government that will ultimately lay the nation's nuclear ambitions to rest. Let me give you 2 reasons why I believe this is a dangerous gamble. The first is that there is no guarantee that there will be a change in Iran's internal political position that produces a government more aligned with Western liberal values or policies. And the second is that even amongst many of the reformers, there is a belief that Iran is not entitled to just a civil nuclear program, but to a nuclear deterrent. There is, they would argue, and not without certain justification, already a Sunni Islamic bomb in the shape of Pakistan's nuclear capability. And the reality of these arguments is not going to change. So let's look at some of the other issues. On verification, anything other than totally unrestricted and unfettered access is unacceptable, because we all know, in the light of the Iranians' behavior in the past, how they will manipulate any weakness in the terms of the IAEA's access. Yet, instead of a clear and unambiguous commitment to unfettered access, we have in this agreement this rather bizarre committee structure, and you can only get access to the committee when the IAEA declares a site as suspicious. This was, for me, of all the elements of the deal, the greatest surrender by the international community, and the one which I'm afraid I believe we're most likely to pay a very high price for in the longer term. Then we come to the lifting of sanctions and the unfreezing of Iranian assets. Rather than a graduated lifting of sanctions as a reward for full cooperation on the implementation of the agreement, the P5+1 seems to have caved in completely to the Supreme Leader's demand that sanctions be lifted completely and immediately. Likewise, the immediate unfreezing of up to $150 billion of Iranian assets seems to be yet another surrender to the regime's demands. One of the more ridiculous arguments I've heard is that the money will not necessarily be available to Iran, since a substantial proportion will be used to pay off the debts it already has. In other words, that it's not real money. I have to tell you that if someone paid off my bank overdraft, I would certainly think it was real money, not least because I'd be able to spend other money on something other than the debt repayment. The same holds, I'm afraid, for Iran. We've also been told that the money will not exacerbate the problem of Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran's other proxies, because they were already able to fund them while sanctions were in place. My interpretation would be exactly the opposite. If they regarded them as a priority for funding, when they were already being very tightly squeezed by financial sanctions, then they're likely to see them as prime candidates for extra funding when the tsunami of unfrozen assets hits them in the near future. Next, we come to the lifting of the arms embargo and the issue of ballistic missile technology. Now, this, if I remember correctly, wasn't even in the April agreement. And given that Iranian-supplied arms have been used against our own forces directly in Afghanistan and against our allies through the violent proxies that are supported by Iran, to make such a concession without any guarantees about any change of behavior by Iran in the region seems extraordinary to the point of being incomprehensible. Likewise, the change in policy towards ballistic missile development. In terms of ballistic missile technology, why would you want to develop such a capability when you claim that you have nothing that you wish to deliver by such a system in the first place? All of these, taken together, seem like the fulfillment of the Iranians' wish list rather than a hard-headed negotiation based upon the need to improve regional and global security. And it does rather beg the question as to why such a deal took so long to negotiate at all. So what rationale is given for this approach? We're told that these measures will help Iran to become embedded in the international economic order in a way that will encourage reform and, through economic interdependence, become less of a threat to their neighbours and ourselves. I would just like to point out that bringing Russia into the G8 did not exactly make it less aggressive or expansionist. If anything, it fed Putin's pretensions. There is no guarantee that economic interdependence with a state which has a fundamentally different outlook will produce the desired behaviour. But wait, I'm told. After 1945, Europe became much more economically interdependent, and look how it's led to a prolonged period of peace on that continent. Well, my reply to that is that we're nations with broadly similar outlooks, similar democratic systems, and similar values in relation to the law and individual rights. It's a very different thing when you're playing with someone who has very different rules. Russia, I believe, has taught us an example of that, and I would suggest Iran is another. And if any proof were required, the Supreme Leader has already said that while he supports the deal, he reiterated that the Iranian government was, he said, 180 degrees different to us. We're told that this deal had to be accepted because there was no other approach available. I simply do not believe this to be true. Iran came to the table because sanctions were becoming an enormous burden economically to the extent that it was beginning to threaten political stability. Maintaining sanctions until such time as Iran was willing to accept a tougher deal, more suitable to the P5+1, was certainly an option. It was simply not the option that was chosen. Likewise, we are told that the snapback of sanctions is the solution to any flaws that might be contained within the agreement. Again, this merits, at the least, extreme skepticism. Once Iranian assets are unfrozen and sanctions lifted, Iran will be able to make very rapid progress in seeking the partners needed to repair and update their aging infrastructure in both the civil and military fields. Not only will the effectiveness, potentially, of any subsequent sanctions be diminished with time, but Western governments will face increased pressure from their own domestic industrial interests once contracts have been signed, projects have been started, and profits are put at risk. We know that, and the Iranians know that. Perhaps those of us who don't believe all this are just being cynical. Maybe there will be genuine political change in Iran by the time the 10-year envelope has passed. Maybe any change will make Iran into a constructive partner in the region and beyond. Maybe Iran will offer free and open access to international inspectors. Maybe they will be completely honest and transparent with us. Maybe they will follow their own religious strictures that say developing a nuclear weapon is unacceptable. Maybe they won't use their unfrozen assets to fund proxies in the region in the way that they have in the past. Maybe they won't try to manipulate the terms of the treaty in ways that suit their interests. Maybe they won't improve their coffers with the sale of oil and gas and then at some point utilize their ability for breakout, which might be as little as 7 months, with the upgraded centrifuges that will be allowed to keep. But it's a lot of maybes. The hallmark of Western security policy in recent years has been a triumph of wishful thinking over critical analysis. Policymakers have a duty to make assessments based on how the world really is, not on how they would like the world to be. Wishful thinking is not a great approach to life. It is a dangerous foreign policy, and it's a potentially catastrophic security policy. Let us hope that those of us who have these reservations and who believe that this is simply pushing a difficult problem down the line in order to gain political plaudits today, let us hope that we are wrong. But I wouldn't, ladies and gentlemen, put much money on it. Thank you.
Liam, thank you very much for your terrific remarks. I'd now like to open the floor for questions. If I may take the liberty of asking the first question, Liam, and it's regarding the perception of the Iran deal in the United Kingdom. The Obama administration has given the impression that outside of Washington and perhaps outside of Israel, that there is almost no opposition to the Iran deal. What is the situation on the ground in London at the moment? Of course, the British government has backed the deal. David Cameron is a strong supporter of the deal. But I understand that there are a number of MPs who are opposed to the deal. Is there any prospect of a parliamentary debate taking place in the House of Commons on the Iran agreement in September?
It's rather extraordinary. I was speaking to the excellent Hugh Hewitt last night, who was asking me on his programme much the same question. And there is a great deal of anxiety in the United Kingdom and other European countries as well about this deal. It's quite wrong to portray it as having the full support across the political spectrum. Before the deal was actually announced, there was a debate in Parliament, and a very large number of my colleagues attended and spoke very forcibly about the potential problems that it might create. We've had, because of the parliamentary timetable and the time that the agreement was announced, we've had very little opportunity to actually discuss it. But I would find it very unlikely that there would be no parliamentary debate on this subject. And if the debate doesn't occur in government time, it can happen in what we have as backbenchers time. Our parliamentary timetable is not entirely determined by the executive. And I imagine that there will be a high likelihood of such a debate. And again, I just make the point that I opened with, that it's extremely disappointing that this whole issue has had so little coverage in the British media, where on arriving in the US, it's on virtually every political programme. It's virtually absent from political debate in the UK. That's something that I intend to help put right.
Right, we'll take the first question from the audience. There's a gentleman right here.
Thank you very much. I am Dr. Nisar Chaudhry with the Pakistan American League. My question is that the depth of debate and division on this issue, if you compare it with the depth of debate and division on this issue in USA and European Union, do you find any difference? Number one. Number two, in this negotiation, do you think Iran singularly outsmarted all the other 5 players? And the last thing is, if you could say that, what were the other options other than negotiations to settle this issue? Thank you.
Well, I think there is discord over the agreement politically in Europe. I think it's perhaps less partisan than it seems to be in the United States, which brings it a greater focus, I think, here as an issue. I think that the Iranians, well, let's put it this way. Look at the agreement itself, compare it to our initial demands and Iran's initial demands, and see who it ends up being closer to. And that, for me, says that the Iranians actually managed to get a great deal of what they wanted. And I'm not sure that we got what we wanted, because I go back to the point, our original aim was that Iran would never be able to develop a nuclear weapon. We've now got a suspended period of 10 years. There's nothing to ensure that at the end of that 10 years, with the money they will have gained from the sale of oil and gas, getting back into the global economy, with the unfreezing of their assets, with their breakout capability, that they won't simply turn around and say, right, we've done the 10-year suspension, now we're going to get the weapon. And at that point, we have left ourselves with no levers, except the re-implementation of sanctions, which by that point will probably be much less of a threat to them than they are today. That's what worries me. And so I think that they have got more than we have, frankly, from this particular negotiation. And so your third point?
The third point was, what were the other options?
Well, the other option was to continue with sanctions until Iran was willing to accept an agreement that we thought was much more foolproof in terms of our original aims to stop them getting nuclear weapon capability. And this idea that we had to somehow, in the summer of 2015, accept an agreement that we thought was at best below expectations, let's put it that way, that we had to accept it right now rather than continue with sanctions and see if we couldn't get a better deal from them later on. Why now? Why did it have to be right now that we had to get this deal? Why did we accept a deal that was well below what we initially asked for? I think the answer is that this was about politics more than it was about security. And that is generally, in the longer term, not a good way to set your priorities.
Yes, hi. Sharon Bovat, Voice of a Moderate. I want to compliment you about saying it's about politics. I was at an unclassified briefing about the Iran deal that included people in the UN, staffers, and we were talking about how the mainstream media has kept information away from the general public, and it's even more so in the UK. It was declassified a few years ago by the DIA that Iran did play a role in the Lockerbie bombing, and if people knew that, they might be against this deal. What I've heard is that the mainstream media refuses to report that because they're embarrassed. I don't know if what I heard is correct, but what I'd like to know, especially in the UK, they're not even having this dialogue. At least in America, we have this dialogue, and I've been told this deal's going to be pushed through because of the 3.67% of the enrichment. But the issue is that who's monitoring the enrichment? And this thing needs to be educated, and people just can't understand it because of the complexity. So any comments you have, and I believe, like you said, it's the mainstream media not reporting it, not educating the people, and it's the politics. Thank you.
Well, Niall very kindly mentioned the book that I wrote, which contains quite a large section on Iran. And part of the problem is that contemporary politics and political discussion, as you rightly say, often has very little historical context around it. You'd be hard-pressed to hear anyone talking about Iran pre-1979. It's although it didn't have any history before that generally in political circles. And what I wanted to set out was why Iran has, in reply to this gentleman's question, has a very sophisticated diplomatic capability. It always has. It's been well known for running rings round opponents over time. Iran has a very long record of involvement in all sorts of terror groups and proxies in the region and beyond. And if you're very good now, I might ensure you get a copy of it. But I do think that we need to educate our public much more about these issues. I kind of liken it when I was still practicing medicine. My wife would say when I had a real job, that you don't simply walk in, look at a blood test and make a diagnosis. You want to see the patient. You want to ask about their past history. You want to ask about their family history. You want to know some context. And too much of our politics is discussed in 2 dimensions rather than 3. And I think we need to put that right. It's one of the duties of politicians to educate as well as make policy, I think.
Question here from Michaela.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that excellent talk, Dr. Fox. Here in the United States, some proponents of the deal have been making quite a lot of the 24 snapback period, yet with lifting of sanctions up front and essentially no gradual way to address Iran's potential cheating. What is your take on? Could you flesh out a little more how that provision is not particularly effective in bringing Iran back to compliance with the terms of the agreement?
Well, I think that you put it very well, because what's happened in the agreement is that Iran gets all the rewards immediately, and we are left with fewer and fewer potential sanctions should they not stick by the agreement. So they get the unfreezing of the assets and the lifting of sanctions very early on in the process. After that, when they have access to money, when they've got access to Western contracts and capabilities to be able to bring their economy back up to shape and to repair their damaged infrastructure, what sanctions are we going to be able to apply? And if we are able to apply them, how effective will they be? And we have the second problem, which I also mentioned, which is that once these sanctions are lifted, once you've got Western companies going into Iran and doing business, it will be more and more difficult for democratic governments in the West to reapply sanctions, even if they're justified. And I think we are making this very difficult for ourselves. We are loading this deal very heavily on the Iranian side and leaving ourselves with too few levers should Iran, I'm afraid, go back to its old behavior of trying to manipulate the agreement and behaving in what I can most kindly describe as an utterly untransparent way. And I think that we should have done something quite different, which was that Iran gets rewarded for maintaining clear implementation of the deal and unfettered access, and they got a graduated process of having assets unfrozen and sanctions lifted. That seems to me to have been a much more sensible approach, but it seems we've given everything away at the outset, and it's all predicated on hope. We hope that they will change.
Yes, gentleman here in the front. And if anyone who's asked a question could identify themselves and also any institutional affiliation, that would be tremendous. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Raphael Danziger. I'm an advisor to APAC. And first of all, with regard to the point about the 24 days, I think that something has not been really paid attention to much is the fact that the countdown for the 24 days, which the administration says is enough time, not enough time for Iran to cheat, only starts after the IAEA gets access to a facility, undeclared facility. However, according to the annex to the agreement, First of all, Iran has to answer a concern that the IAEA gives about any kind of undeclared facility, but there's no deadline for that. In other words, all Iran has to do is to drag out the time until it answers any concern by the IAEA about an undeclared facility. It can go on for years. So it's the 24 days, not really 24 days, it's really unlimited. I think the verification of declared facility is reasonable. It's the undeclared facility like Palchin and others, that's, I think, really a huge weakness. The second thing I think few people pay attention to is that nobody actually signed the agreement. It's not a signed agreement. And actually, just the other day, President Rouhani said, we should not bring this agreement to the parliament because if we bring it to the parliament, then I'd have to sign it. And if I sign it, that gives that forces Iran into obligation it does not want to have. So I think those are 2 points that have not been paid enough attention to.
Well, thank you. And I think that this is, as they say in the news, a developing story. And I think as debate becomes more substantial, not about the big picture, but about the details, I think there'll be greater public anxiety about this deal, which is why I think we need to start a genuine public debate, not about Iran is bad, the West is good, but actually focus on what it says and what the implications of it will be and how it would operate under the most adverse circumstances, not the most optimal circumstances. That's the debate we need to get into, and the points you make are extremely valid in that.
Yes, the lady over here.
Thank you for an excellent speech, Dr. Fox. I'm Cynthia Farhat. I'm an associate and writing fellow at the Middle East Forum. America being safe is I have a very personal interest of having it safe because I fled Egypt for my life in 2011. So if we did not have America, I would perish. So I'm looking at this whole situation from the perspective of the Iranians and from Islamic jurisprudence that I had to study for 12 years because it was the law of my country, not because I adhere to it in any way. I'm non-Muslim. But according to Islamic jurisprudence, this treaty satisfies every single law of fiqh al-mu'ahadat, which is the jurisprudence of treaties. And according to the jurisprudence of treaties, this so-called treaty is called a hudna, which is a temporary truce, and the limitations of it is 10 years. And after the 10 years, a Muslim ruler is obligated, according to Sharia law, and limited to a violent attack and waging war against the nation that either the nation that they have the treaty with, or the hudna with, or its allies. That's what it explicitly says. Or else the Muslim ruler would not be legitimate anymore. And I don't think the Iranians, if it satisfies every law of fiqh al-mu'ahadat, I don't think they would sacrifice their rule to satisfy the United States or the West. So my question is this taken in the consideration of the political discourse in Europe or in the United States of America, how the Iranians are looking at it, and thus the implications of it if Iran does in fact act upon its promise of death to America and death to Israel and starts to act upon it? Is there repercussions, or is this put in the considerations? Thank you, sir.
Well, I will not even attempt to get into issues of Iranian jurisprudence. I might as well try to talk Swahili. But I think what is very clear is that the mindset of the West in coming to this agreement with Iran is chances are Iran will change in that time. Chances are, with a young population, it'll become much more liberal. Chances are the regime as we know it at the moment will be fundamentally altered. I don't know what guarantees anyone believes there are that will happen. And yet this whole agreement is predicated on that. It's predicated on the fact that at the end of the 10 years, Iran will not be the same threat, regionally or globally, that we see it as being today, were it to achieve nuclear weapon status. And I can see circumstances in which the successor to Khamenei is actually more fundamentalist than he is. I think there's nothing at all that suggests that any change will necessarily be more liberal and more pro-Western than how many he is at the present time. I think this is a dangerous gamble. And I think that to try to guess what the world will look like, what any country, any regime will look like in a decade's time, and then base your security policy upon it, is really placing too much value on hope over experience.
My name is Mitsuo Nakai. What about Israel, a threat to Israel because of this deal?
Well, clearly, Iran as a nuclear state poses a potentially existential threat to Israel. That, I think, has to be taken as read. But I think that we need to understand the implications for regional security as a whole and global security implications as well. While it's extremely important, and I'm a great supporter of the State of Israel, it's of great importance to see the threat that it poses to Israel in particular. We should understand the implications far more widely of Iran being able to get a nuclear weapon capability, because it's not simply about Iran getting a nuclear capability and the threat it poses to Israel, it's what it would trigger. Because in no time at all, you can bet that you're in an arms race where Saudi wants to get a nuclear weapon, where Egypt might want to get a nuclear weapon, Turkey might want to get a nuclear weapon in response to any Iranian capability. And surely after all that we did at the end of the Cold War to try to prevent proliferation and all the measures that were put in place in the former Soviet republics to try to stop that, we don't want to leave to the next generation a new nuclear arms race in the world's most unstable region. Surely we want something more than that. I'm the first to say, as I did at the beginning, any agreement that actually stops Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, genuinely stops them, is to be welcomed. I just don't believe in my heart that this agreement gives us anything like the guarantees that we need. And it's, I'm almost sad to not be supporting it. But I think you have to be realistic in policy. And as I said, wishful thinking is not a good basis for national security, nor the security of our allies.
Gentleman at the back.
Hi, Andrew Overton. And though I don't sound it, I work at the British Embassy. So just wanted to push back. I appreciate your comments greatly. Just wanted to push back a bit on this couple points you make about sanctions. And that they'll be lifted immediately. I believe the deal says that they'll only be lifted after IAEA verification. The IAEA have verified certain restrictions. And then on snapback, British Foreign Secretary has been very clear that he would snap back sanctions if Iran cheats. So continuing with that theme, you mentioned that the alternative would be more sanctions to presumably get Iran back to the negotiating table. Do you really think China, Russia, the other P5 will sign up to that, to more sanctions? Would you think that even they would return to the negotiating table?
My point was that we didn't have to have an agreement now. Iran was becoming more compliant because of the impact that sanctions were already having. We had an option to continue with the sanctions until such times as Iran was willing to accept an agreement more to our liking. But we decided not to do that, and I'll leave that open for debate as to why that occurred. I think that, if you look at the difficulty that there often is when sanctions are being applied, in the time scale ahead, as I think I made the 2 points. One is that will sanctions have equal impact once Iran has had a lifting of the restrictions on it at the present time and the unfreezing of its financial assets? Will sanctions be as effective in the future? And secondly, will Western and other governments be willing to reapply sanctions when they have large financial vested interests that they don't have at the present time? And democratic governments come under pressures that the Chinese government and others don't come under. And when you have large industrial interests able to make profits from an opened up Iran, there'll be a lot of pressure on Western governments not to close it down again. That is just the reality of what happens in Western politics, and I think we need to accept that. And I think that this idea that the snapback could happen very quickly or very easily, I think we have to question that, because I don't actually believe it to be true.
Just to follow up on that point, Liam, isn't it, it's very hard to imagine the Russians and the Chinese supporting the reimposition of UN Security Council sanctions against Iran, not least with the Russians supplying weapons to Tehran and a very, very close relationship between Moscow and Tehran. So the whole snapback idea seems to be a bit of an illusion, really.
Well, I think it's been overplayed, because I do think there is a real danger that some of the players who are required to make sanctions bite would be a lot more unwilling in the future than they have been in the past. And added to that, the point I make to the gentleman from the British Embassy is that the democratic Western governments will have different pressures applied to them because of their industrial and commercial interests. So it is not as easy, and it's not as clear, I think, as is being portrayed.
Absolutely. There's actually there are two questions here. I'll take this gentleman first, and then after this.
Hi, thank you for your comments. Javier from Martinez, Heritage Foundation. Given the imminence of the weapons sales from Russia to Tehran, how likely do you think it is that the Israelis may strike in order to prevent, the development of an aggressive nuclear program?
At the moment, I don't. I don't think it likely. But you can never rule anything out, and you add instability into an already unstable region. Who knows what the final outcomes and implications will be? Impossible to say, but I think it would be unwise for anyone to rule out that there might be a potential military response at some point in the future by Israel to what they perceived as an increasing risk to their national security.
Yes, sir. Thank you for your fine speech. Link Smith, retired Navy. Recent polls from Pew show that Americans don't approve of this treaty. Another recent poll shows that the British population, different poll, they're a bit more enthusiastic, if I may, towards the treaty. Why is it that this disapproval for this treaty, per these polls, is not out in the media?
Well, fortunately, one of the things I'm never answerable for is the behavior of the media, for which I'm eternally grateful. It is interesting, however. First of all, it's interesting that there's the discrepancy between the two, and that the American population are less inclined to support the deal than the British population. I haven't seen these polls, but I have no reason to doubt what you say. What's the difference between the two? There's been more debate about it in the United States, and that to me sounds a great deal like the more people know about it, the less they like it. And the answer to the conundrum in the United Kingdom is to open up the debate. But trying to get articles into the British press on this issue is extremely difficult. Of course, the obsession in Europe is very different, and the obsession in terms of the Middle East is the migrant crisis and not Iran. But it's part of a continuum, and it does need to be debated in greater detail. And one of the reasons that I'm here today is to try, through agencies such as Heritage, to try to get that debate opened up in the United Kingdom. It's extremely important that we do so. It's being a bit crowded out by other events in the Middle East at the present time, but it doesn't diminish its importance. And just because people don't want to hear something doesn't mean politicians shouldn't say it.
Liam, could you comment on the migrant crisis in Europe at the moment? It's the number one political issue across the Atlantic, and of course directly related to the current situation in the Middle East, particularly in Syria. And could you address, how Europe is responding to this crisis? Perhaps what needs to be done in terms of the big picture to address it?
First of all, I would differentiate between economic migrants who are coming from all over the region to try and get work and better living conditions by being in Europe. That is understandable, but we are not simply there to be the recipients for everybody who wants a better life. I draw a distinction between those people and those poor souls who are fleeing one of the most cruel and vicious organizations, ISIS, that we have seen in our world for a very long time. And it is pitiful to watch them trying to bring their children not just to a place where they can get more money, but where they can be safe. And I think our failure to act in Syria is coming home to roost. We need to set up a safe zone. There needs to be a secure zone in Syria where people can live without fear of beheadings and crucifixions and cruelty and gang rape and the other things that we've seen from ISIS. And that's going to require at some point, if you want to stem the flow of these poor people trying to escape this, we'll need to have military action by an international coalition with a no-fly zone and a protected element and zone inside Syria. Otherwise, the flow will continue. And there's no point in simply saying we're not going to allow people to cross our borders. We need to deal with the cause of the problem and not simply the symptoms of the problem. And the longer we wait, the more the cost in terms of human suffering will rise. Just let me add this one thought. Not acting is a policy. Not acting is a choice. And not acting brings its own consequences. And you have to weigh the cost of action against the cost of inaction. And for many people across the political spectrum, the cost of inaction is rising too high.
And Liam, the House of Commons is expected to debate British military action against ISIS in Syria itself, and that debate is expected sometime in September. Could you comment on how you see that debate moving, and also on what Britain needs to do exactly in terms of military action against ISIS?
Well, first of all, there has been, for reasons that I don't quite understand, a confusion between the vote about response to the use of chemical weapons by Syria and military action against ISIS. So it seems to me patently absurd that we accept that it's okay to carry out military strikes against ISIS in Iraq, but not against ISIS in Syria. I mean, they're either a threat to your national security or they're not. And if they're a threat to your national security, you have to deal with it. And the idea that what is in effect a non-existent border in the sand should be an obstruction to us dealing with what we perceive and have described as the biggest threat to our security for a generation just leaves me, for one, speechless. What we require to do is something else also, and that is to recognise that the battle against ISIS is not simply a battle to be fought on the ground against a military force. This is an ideological battle. We need to understand the scale of the challenge we face. In the Cold War, we understood that we had to utilize not just our military capability against the Soviet Union, or not even the economic ability that underpinned that military capability, but our moral case for our own superiority. And I described in my book a discussion that I had in the Élysée Palace. And I said, why was it that in the Cold War we were willing to use the word better, that capitalism was better, that freedom was better, that democracy was better than the alternatives? But nowadays, we don't. I happen to believe that religious tolerance is better than enforced orthodoxy. I believe that treating women as equal citizens is better than treating them as second class. I believe that the values that we hold are better than the alternatives that are put forward by the Islamists. And when I made this argument, the answer was this. I don't think today we can say better, just different. If we only believe that what we stand for is different to the alternatives, and not better than the alternatives. We ourselves will not have the moral courage to do what we believe is right, and we will not have the moral authority internationally to do so. It is time in the West that we stopped using different and started using better. And we have to start seeing the information revolution not as a threat to our security, but as an opportunity for us to propagate those values that have made us what we are. And it's time for us to say that countries like the United Kingdom, like the United States, Australia, Canada, we are not who we are by accident. We are who we are by design, because of the decisions that we have taken, because of the decisions of our forebears and the consequences they have had. It's time to get back into the values argument. And that values argument is just as important in the long term in defeating ISIS or Al-Shabaab or whatever the subsequent threat might be as the all too easy military response. This is something that requires a fight by our whole society and not just our military.
Lady at the back there.
Thank you very, very much for your excellent, excellent speech and bringing us up to date on what really is. And my big concern that this document to me is just a peace at any price. And the peace that we get is a piece of blank paper, and the price we pay is for our future, and as you said, for our values. And it seems to me that what we really need is to go back to peace through strength. I think we need a lesson in history that 1979, the hostages were released when the political side was very liberal and was just going along and going along. The Iranians will move when they think they've got the best deal, and they weren't sure. When did they let them go? Right at the inaugural, when the former president took off, and Ronald Reagan, whom they weren't sure what he would do as the cowboy. And that's when we got peace through strength. And that's what we need today. We need peace through strength. And in addition to that, I have another concern. Is this going to give them full diplomatic authority, or are we going to have limitations? Are we going to give them back their embassy here too, which is in a very crucial location, and especially for the British Embassy, which is a block down Massachusetts Avenue across the street. And it's been vacant since 1979, except for when it was used by the State Department and rented out. So that's a concern to me. It's also just across the bridge from our mosque, and right across from the Italian, the Brazilian, and all of the other embassies on Embassy Row. And that would be a perfect center for a little mischief. So I don't know whether anybody has ever brought that up, but that's one thing that's been a great concern to me.
Well, I guess that the aim is to see a greater and greater normalization in relations with Iran. That in itself is not a bad thing, but it has to be earned. And my point is to give all these things at the beginning of the process, before they've been earned, before they have shown that they are willing to implement the agreement itself, seems just a touch naive.
Well, it's a philosophy between East and West. We have time is of the essence, and they have fardo pas fardo.
We have the West, as I described it, the policy where wishful thinking trumps critical analysis, is in spades what we've done with Russia. Russia launched a cyber attack on Estonia. We didn't do anything. They cut off Ukraine's gas in breach of treaty. We did nothing. They invaded Georgia. They're still there. And our response was minimal. And the last time I was here in Washington, one of the US senators, I won't name them, said to me, "I'm really worried that Putin's misreading the signals from the West." I said, "You know what? Putin is perfectly reading the signals from the West. He acts, we don't respond. He acts, we don't respond. He acts, we don't respond." What's difficult to read about that?
Dan Codas over there.
Hi, Daniel Coaches from the Heritage Foundation. Thank you again for your remarks, Dr. Fox. moving forward, it seems like the Democrats in the U.S. are going to filibuster, and the deal will be implemented. What are the steps moving forward that people who don't believe that this deal is going to lead to the outcome of Iran not obtaining a nuclear weapon? What are the steps that should be taken moving forward? Thank you.
Well, it looks like the agreement will go ahead, and we will be stuck once it's accepted. We'll be stuck with its terms, with all the risks that I think are inherent in it. What I think we will have to do, the best we can do, is to ensure that the rights of access by the IAEA are fully upheld, and that the sort of stalling techniques that have been described, that we've seen in the past by Iran, are not allowed to buy them extra time. Even the year's breakout, I don't believe is an accurate figure. I think that figure is much more like 7 or 8 months than a year's breakout. And there are so many risks in all of this process. I genuinely find it hard to be optimistic about it. And I think we are sadly going to be limited into what levers we have to pull if our anxieties grow over the years ahead. One of my, when this was brought out in the House of Commons, the Foreign Secretary, my friend Philip Hammond, said he thought it had the potential to be a historical agreement. Or it was a historical agreement in which a backbencher in the House of Commons said, with all due respect, history will determine whether it's a historic agreement. And a generic lesson for all politicians in that one.
Gentleman here.
Thank you. A follow-up on the issue of refugees. The vast majority of refugees from Syria were not caused by ISIS, really, but by Bashar Assad, supported by Iran, who killed many, many more people and tortured, except not in front of the TV cameras. And the question is, shouldn't the military action or any kind of action that you propose be both against ISIS and against Bashar Assad to remove him from power, as has been demanded by the United States a long time ago?
Well, I'm not going to go into the complexities of Iran, except of Syria, except to say this. That it has been the movement of ISIS that has caused, in recent times, this mass movement of refugees. You're quite right that the civil war in Syria was already causing a great deal of instability, and this is instability upon instability, if you like. And it's not just the number of refugees coming to Europe. I was recently in Turkey. No one seems to be mentioning that the Turks have seen potentially 2 million people crossing their border as refugees, which is a huge problem for any country. And again, we know what ISIS are capable of. We've seen what they've been doing. We've seen their animal behavior towards their fellow human beings in the name of so-called religion. And at some point, we have to raise our game. And a few airstrikes on ISIS in Iraq is not going to be enough, because it's not giving the civilian population the safety that they require. And I go back to my earlier point. With the Marsh Arabs, for example, and in Iraq, we were able to achieve no-fly zones. We were able to achieve zones of safety so that people could live without fear in their own country. We're going to have to do something similar again. I know we don't want to do it, and I know that public opinion may not be in favor of doing it, but if we only want to have the policies that are already accepted by the public, why don't we just give up and let the pollsters run the country? Politics is about leading, not just reflecting public opinion.
Let me take the last two questions, actually, and from this gentleman and the gentleman over here.
Okay. Where you touched the base a little bit, where can we go from here? What can we do about it? I mean, it would have to be approved by the U.S. Senate. I heard the 34th senator is agreeing with the deal.
Well, I'm sure.
There's not much U.S. Senate can do now.
On the Iranian deal, I think I think it's going through. That's it. It's going to happen. This deal is going to be a reality. And we're going to have to exactly work out what room for manoeuvre we have within the terms of this agreement. We just have to really hope that people like me are wrong, and very wrong, because if we're right, if we're even half right, we've not got a lot of levers to pull should Iran change its behavior in a direction that doesn't suit our security interests.
You had a final question, sir?
Thank you very much. I'm coming back after this commercial. My question is that in U.S. administration generally believed that if the sanctions were continued, certainly Iran was under tremendous pressure and financial crunch. But if they were allowed to continue still, they were getting close to developing a nuclear device. And to stop them, you had to go on war. So they preferred to negotiate and stall the process than to go on war. What is your take on that?
Well, I understand the desire to get an agreement. And as I said at the very beginning, any agreement that genuinely stopped Iran being able to get access to a nuclear weapon capability would have to be welcomed because it would reduce the threats to the region and beyond. My question is, to go back to an answer to your earlier question, who got most of what they wanted out of the agreement? Is it closer to the Iranians' starting position in negotiations or our starting position in negotiations? And I think in this one, the winner's pretty clear.
I'd like to thank Liam Fox for a terrific presentation today and a very, very engaging Q&A session here. Certainly a huge number of questions remaining with regard to the Iran nuclear deal, which does strike us here at Heritage as an extremely dangerous deal that will undercut the security of the United States, Great Britain, and America's allies across the world. But Liam, thank you very much for joining us here again at Heritage. We hope that you will rejoin us in the coming months, and wish you all the best as well with the upcoming parliamentary debates and the reconvening of the House of Commons next week. Thank you, Liam.